The night wore on at a strange, almost unnatural pace, as if each minute stretched longer than usual. According to an anonymously circulated audio recording, it was around 8 in the evening when the atmosphere in the room began to take on a tension that was hard to ignore. The warm light from the lamps failed to soften the sense of unease that spread among the tables. Some guests spoke in hushed tones, others drank to fill the silence, but everything seemed enveloped in a dense atmosphere, sustained by something no one wanted to name. In a corner of the hall, practically hidden by the shadow cast by a column, sat Yu Menglong. According to the release testimony, his posture was rigid, as if every movement cost him effort. His hands rested on his thighs, trembling slightly as he tried to maintain a neutral expression. Around her, several men dressed in black moved with an unsettling familiarity. One of them would approach every now and then to pour him more alcohol, tilting the bottle with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Menglong barely touched the rim of the glass with his lips, taking only a small, almost symbolic sip. The testimony recounts that his gaze avoided direct eye contact, as if he feared provoking something simply by lifting his eyes. Even so, his tension was evident. In an environment where everything was supposed to be celebration, his presence stood out abruptly. The account describes him as appearing very uncomfortable, almost forced to be there, a guest trapped in a role he hadn't chosen. As the night wore on, the music grew louder, faces flushed redder, and the atmosphere became more charged. Around 11:20, according to the account, the first break occurred. An employee, identified only as Xiaowei, was returning from the bathroom when she heard a sharp, dry sound, a thud that didn't match the party's normal din. Curiosity overcame her fear. She approached the half-open door, and upon looking inside, the emotional impact left her paralyzed. According to his statement, a burly man in a dark suit was holding Menglong by the shoulders and covering his mouth with his right hand. The actor's body moved in a disjointed manner, as if he were trying to resist but no longer had the strength to do so. The back of the sofa had been dislodged by the force of his movements, and his shirt, according to the witness, was partially torn, leaving part of his abdomen exposed. At that instant, the man in the suit, the story continues, turned his head toward the door with a breathlessly aggressive motion. His eyes, described as extremely hostile, locked onto the employee. He pointed a finger at her and, according to the audio, uttered a threat that chilled the blood of anyone who heard it. The young woman, on the verge of panic, dropped the tray she was carrying and fled without looking back. When he mustered the courage to return a few seconds later, he saw Menglong lying on the sofa, apparently immobilized. The testimony adds that other men, 3 or 4 dressed casually, had begun pouring alcohol directly from the bottle into his mouth. According to this account, the liquid spilled onto his skin, trickling down his neck and soaking his clothes as he tried to move his head to avoid it. One of those present, identified in the narrative as the man in the patterned shirt, reportedly reacted with anger when Menglong vomited during the scuffle. The vomit splattered his clothes, which, according to the account, triggered a violent outburst. The man grabbed a bottle and, still according to the testimony, smashed it against the actor's face. The witness claims to have seen drops of a reddish liquid on the mouth of one of the empty bottles, although she could not confirm whether it was actually blood. Later, when the room was finally empty, another employee of the venue claimed to have found more than 10 strong bottles stacked in a corner, some still wet. Those details, unverified by any official source, became loose pieces of a puzzle that many have tried to reassemble ever since. The same witness added that, at the end of the meeting, he saw 2 men carrying Menglong out of the room. According to his account, his head hung to one side, his legs trembled involuntarily, and his body seemed unable to support itself. At that moment, the employee thought it was simply too much alcohol, a common occurrence at parties like that. However, after hearing the other accounts, he publicly admitted that perhaps it had been something more serious. The next morning, according to reports, the police arrived at the scene and ordered the employees not to say anything about what had happened. No one dared to contradict that instruction. The presence of the authorities, far from alleviating the situation, seemed to increase the confusion among those present. The silence was immediate, almost automatic, as if a shadow had fallen over every unspoken word. Shortly afterward, when news of Menglong's death began to circulate, the initial fear turned into a sense of guilt and anguish among those who had been there that night to eat. It was only when the actor's mother appeared on social media in tears, according to the accounts that have been circulated, that some employees dared to anonymously reveal what they believed they had witnessed. Thus, the account of the inevitable night did not emerge from a single voice, but from the sum of scattered fragments, pieces of an emotional mosaic narrated by people who, it is said, would prefer to erase what happened from their memories. This first set of testimonies illustrates not only the critical minutes, but also a more complex backdrop: fear, pressure, and the idea that in certain circles, silence is the only possible alternative. And it is precisely there that the root of the problem emerges. The case cannot be analyzed solely as an isolated incident of violence, but rather as part of a deeper structure described by those familiar with the industry as a system in which power, obligation, and silent control are intertwined. According to later statements, the atmosphere that night would not have been an exception, but rather an extreme manifestation of dynamics that, according to various sources, exist in the less visible layers of the entertainment industry. The night of the incident, always from a narrative point of view and based on unverified testimonies, represents the turning point. It was not a sudden act or an outburst without context. According to these accounts, it was the culmination of accumulated pressures, unmet expectations, and tensions inherent in an environment where obedience is valued more than individuality. Understanding those final minutes involves looking back and examining a system that many describe as hermetic, hierarchical, and difficult to challenge. At that intersection of silence, power, and vulnerability lies the root of this story, a fragile balance that night finally broke. The news spread first as a whisper, then as an unsettling murmur, and finally as an unstoppable roar. Just hours after that, Nighty described in multiple unverified accounts, the first fragments began to circulate. Ambiguous messages, posts deleted with unusual speed, and questions that seemed to arise from every direction. The death of Yu Menglong, an actor whose public image had always been synonymous with serenity, triggered an immediate and explosive reaction on social media. According to various observations by users who managed to circumvent the censorship, the first 24 hours were a silent chaos. Thousands of comments appeared only to vanish within minutes. Trending hashtags were suddenly blocked, and profiles attempting to share testimonies claimed to have been restricted. Information didn't flow naturally, but in fits and starts, as if struggling to break through increasingly stringent containment mechanisms. It was precisely this instability that further fueled public suspicion. Each deleted post became circumstantial evidence for some, a rumor for others, but above all, an emotional fuel that made it impossible to extinguish the case easily. In parallel, thousands of users outside China's digital borders began spreading screenshots, transcripts, and recordings they claimed to have obtained through alternative channels. Although none of it had been officially verified, the speed with which these fragments spread was extraordinary. Within hours, international forums, analysis accounts, and entertainment news channels were already discussing the case with growing intensity. The emotional impact was immediate. For many, Menglong represented an almost intangible figure, someone whose public persona embodied a type of purity rarely seen in the entertainment industry. The idea that his death might be shrouded in still unexplained circumstances sparked a wave of shock that is difficult to quantify. Comments such as, "It can't be true, this doesn't fit his image," or "There must be something more behind it," were replicated thousands of times. However, the reaction was not uniform. While one sector called for clarity and justice, another urged caution, noting that none of the information being circulated had been confirmed by authorities or official media. This division was especially visible in international communities. Some users argued that only amplified misinformation was circulating. Others insisted that censorship was precisely why it was necessary to continue sharing any available testimony. What was indisputable was the speed with which a spontaneous movement arose. Phrases like, "Let's not let them forget him," "Don't erase his story," and "May his voice live on," began to be repeated in multiple languages. Even those who were unfamiliar with Menglong's story joined in, moved by the feeling that they were witnessing something that should not be silenced. Video platforms also got involved without intending to. According to some content creators, several clips mentioning the case were demonetized or marked as sensitive. Others claimed that the visibility of their posts was drastically reduced within minutes. All of this helped reinforce the narrative that there was an attempt to limit public discussion. In this climate of uncertainty, the first more elaborate reactions emerged. In-depth analyses, temporal reconstructions based solely on the published testimonies, and videos that sought to contextualize the case within the industry's already known issues. The tone of these posts ranged from formal restraint to expressions of collective sadness. But they all shared a common element: the impossibility of ignoring the topic. The most significant moment of this media frenzy occurred when the audio attributed to the event staff was released. Although its authenticity could not be confirmed, it served as an emotional catalyst. The meticulous descriptions of the setting, Menglong's gestures, the sounds inside the room, all of this allowed listeners to visualize the scene in an almost cinematic way. And, as often happens, when an image takes hold in the collective mind, the debate ceases to be purely rational. It was then that a question arose that was replicated thousands of times. What do you think about this? Comment Amen below so we can continue the unfinished stories. That phrase, repeated in different languages, transformed the discussion into a participatory phenomenon. It wasn't just about observing a case, but about holding the memory of someone whom many perceived as deeply vulnerable. On an emotional level, the figure of Menglong began to take on symbolic dimensions. There was talk of his apparent kindness, the calm he exuded, and the discreet gestures that characterized him. Even people who had never seen his dramas or interviews claimed to feel an unexpected connection to the story. This process, known in media analysis as the construction of cultural martyrs, typically occurs when a public figure embodies values that the audience considers threatened. On a practical level, there were also repercussions. Some audiovisual projects in which Menglong had participated began circulating again on international platforms, fueled by a wave of solidarity. In several Spanish-speaking countries, entertainment channels aired retrospectives of his career, highlighting the elegance of his performances and the gentle quality of his stage presence. None of this changed the lack of official information, but it did help reinforce global attention on his case. On the other hand, the silence of formal institutions became a narrative element in itself. The absence of detailed statements created a void that was quickly filled by conjecture, alternative analyses, and theories of varying intensity. This information vacuum became the main driver of the media frenzy. When there is no clear official version, every fragment, every audio clip, every anonymous testimony gains disproportionate significance. As the days passed, the case ceased to be solely the concern of Menglong's fans and became a transnational cultural phenomenon. Some Latin American users began launching campaigns to keep the conversation alive, while others in Europe focused on highlighting the need to protect entertainment industry workers in highly vulnerable situations. Ultimately, the case transcended the individual figure of the actor and became a discussion about power, silence, and the dangers of what cannot be said openly. The echo of that media avalanche continues to resonate, not because there are clear answers, but because the questions persist. And in that constant questioning, the story continues. Crisis management doesn't begin when the first public question arises, but when the truth, whatever it may be, crashes against a wall of silence. In the case of Yu Menglong, according to the multiple unverified accounts that circulated in the days following his death, that wall appeared immediately. Before the public could even formulate a concrete question, an atmosphere of information containment had already been established, a strategy that, far from calming the waters, seemed to intensify collective unease. The first move on the crisis chessboard was, according to observers, absence. No detailed statement, no lengthy communique, no visible effort to clarify what had happened. Silence is a powerful tool when used to protect privacy or allow for a rigorous investigation, but it can also trigger suspicion when the context is already fraught with tension. Here, according to analyses by users and content creators, the lack of responses was interpreted as a calculated maneuver to control the narrative. Unlike other high-profile cases where a public figure or agency steps forward to offer condolences, preliminary explanations, or commitments to transparency, this case began without an official voice to guide the conversation. The result was immediate. Digital citizens constructed their own narrative. The gaps were filled with conjectures, hypotheses, and reconstructions based on third-party testimonies. The second move in this crisis management was the fragmented reaction of those closest to the actor. Some acquaintances, according to unverified accounts, privately expressed that they could not speak openly. Others claimed they had been advised not to comment. None of these accounts can be confirmed, but the collective perception they generated was powerful. A circle of silence surrounded what had happened. Menglong's family, according to the posts that circulated, was the most visible exception. The appearance of his mother crying on camera and on social media, which, according to users, was quickly removed or restricted on some platforms, became an emotional turning point. While the family displayed evident grief, the institutional narrative remained minimal, almost non-existent. From a crisis management perspective, this dissonance created a conflict between public emotion and structural silence. A third key element of the strategy, or lack thereof, was the alleged immediate intervention in the spaces where the party took place. According to reports, the police arrived early the next morning to conduct an inspection and asked employees not to discuss any details of the event. Although this information is unverified, the perception it created was that any spontaneous dissemination was being limited. In the logic of crisis, actions interpreted as damage control often have the opposite effect. They amplify attention on what is being controlled. On the other hand, in the case of celebrities with international exposure, it is usually customary for the artist's representation team to issue an official statement. However, in this story, according to users who followed the case in real time, there was no extensive statement from the team explaining the actor's emotional, physical, or professional state before the incident. The absence of a structured message left room for something worse than a rumor: the perception of abandonment. This void led to a fourth critical point in crisis management: the public construction of accountability. According to the testimonies that circulated after Menglong's death, there were tensions within his work environment, contractual pressures, and control dynamics that were hard to ignore. But since none of the parties involved issued detailed statements to confirm or refute these assertions, the audience was forced to create its own interpretive framework. Some analysis videos that emerged on international platforms pointed out that a well-managed crisis requires a clear timeline, a coherent stance, a central message, a follow-up plan. In this case, according to these evaluations, none of the elements were present. The fifth movement, or the fifth strategic absence, was the lack of a unified discourse. While independent media outlets translated and replicated testimonies, and social media users produced analyses from various countries, no institutional voice sought to unify the narrative or provide verifiable data. From a public relations perspective, this left fertile ground for multiple interpretations and intense emotions. Crisis management, in any industry, always walks the line between transparency and containment. However, when handled in a fragmented manner, what several observers described in this case happens: the narrative becomes ungovernable. Without guidance, the media avalanche feeds on itself, and any belated words lack impact. The final element in this analysis is perhaps the most decisive: the sense of inevitability. Several international commentators observed that the lack of visible action to clarify the case reinforced a narrative of public impotence. The idea that there would be no answers, no clear apologies, no full explanations, no transparent commitments, became part of the collective imagination. Even those who adopted a prudent approach, insisting on not drawing conclusions without verification, agreed on one thing: the crisis management offered no way for citizens to gain clarity. There were no public information forums, no sequential updates, and no calls for patience backed by data. The handling of the crisis surrounding Menglong's death ended up being, according to content analyses, a case where the most visible strategy was the absence of any strategy. Each silence increased the pressure, each deleted post intensified the speculation, and each lack of explanation amplified the collective anxiety. Therefore, the case ended up offering a painful but significant lesson in communication. When the official narrative completely retreats, the public narrative takes its place, and it does so with an uncontrollable, emotional, and deeply human force. And so, at the intersection of unanswered questions and the need to understand, this part of the narrative is born: a crisis board where each square was marked by absence, time, and distrust. The passage of time, far from calming the conversation surrounding Yu Menglong, seemed to intensify it. Once the media frenzy reached its peak, and the crisis management left more questions than answers, the public narrative began to shift into a different territory: the search for meaning. This phase, known in communication studies as narrative reconstruction, typically emerges when society attempts to understand not only what happened, but also its long-term implications. And in this case, those implications extended far beyond the events of that particular night. According to various unverified accounts that emerged weeks later, some individuals close to the actor claimed that Menglong had expressed professional discomfort in the months prior. These accounts describe a scenario in which contractual pressures, impossible expectations, and an environment that, according to the widely circulated statements, seemed to demand absolute obedience were intertwined. Although such claims have not been confirmed by official sources, the public perception was that the actor's vulnerability was not an isolated circumstance, but part of a broader context. This context sparked a deeper reflection on the power structures in the entertainment industry. Media analysis experts pointed out that, regardless of the veracity of the testimonies, the collective reaction revealed a deeper concern: the sense that artists can become trapped in systems where autonomy is limited and media exposure does not always provide real protection. This type of reflection transcended the individual figure of Menglong and became a critique of broader dynamics. In the midst of this process, another relevant dimension emerged: the lasting emotional impact on the actor's fans. Many described the experience as a breakup, a sense of loss that affected not only those who admired his artistic career, but also those who saw in him a representation of sensitivity and tranquility. On international forums, posts began to appear talking about the peaceful light Menglong conveyed on screen, his serene gaze, and the way his presence evoked calm. The way these descriptions were repeated demonstrated that, for many, Menglong had transcended the role of celebrity to assume a more symbolic one, that of a figure whose vulnerability reflected the audience's own vulnerabilities. The emergence of this symbolism had a particular effect on the collective narrative. Instead of focusing exclusively on the events of the Neti described in the testimonies, the conversation began to incorporate personal stories, memories of TV series, translated interviews, and specific moments from the actor's career. Without intending to, Menglong became an emotional focal point. This type of phenomenon, the consolidation of a public figure as an emotional touchstone, typically occurs when the public feels that injustice or loss affects not only the individual, but also a broader cultural ideal. However, this reconstruction phase was not without tension. As discussions about the need for transparency intensified, so did calls to act responsibly and avoid hasty conclusions. Some analysts insisted that, without verifiable evidence, no theory should be presented as definitive. This contrast between the need for clarity and the obligation of prudence became one of the most complex aspects of the conversation. At the same time, discussions emerged about the legal and structural repercussions of the case. Although no official sanctions were issued in connection with the events described, the public began to question the oversight mechanisms and protection protocols for public figures within certain professional settings. In several open debates, it was argued that, regardless of what happened on the nitty of the incident, the industry needed to review how it handled situations of vulnerability. Meanwhile, Menglong's figure continued to grow in the collective imagination. People who didn't know him began to take an interest in his work, watch his series, and search for old interviews. Others created illustrations, open letters, and compilation videos, all as a way to keep his memory alive, as some users put it. This phenomenon reflects a principle known in media sociology. When a case is shrouded in official silence, the public tends to create its own space for tribute, a space that functions as symbolic resistance to the lack of clarity. The sense of emotional injustice also fueled transnational actions. In Spanish-speaking communities, petitions began to emerge calling for the case not to be forgotten. In other regions, some groups requested a review of working conditions in the entertainment industry, arguing that extreme pressure can create dangerous environments. Although these initiatives were not coordinated with one another, their existence demonstrated that the impact of the case had transcended borders. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the narrative reconstruction was taking two main directions. The first was introspective, a reflection on the value of empathy, human fragility, and the loneliness faced by some public figures. The second era is structural, an analysis of the forces operating behind the industry and how those forces can shape or distort the lives of those who work in it. On both paths, Menglong became a figure who invited reflection. Not because there was any official information confirming his situation, but because his public image, the softness of his voice, the calmness of his gestures, the delicacy with which he portrayed his characters, formed a radical contrast with the emotional turmoil that surrounded his final days. That contrast deeply shocked the public. It is here that the most delicate component of the reconstruction process emerges: hope. Despite the institutional silence, many people began to express a common desire that one day the facts would be clarified. It wasn't just about getting answers, but about giving dignity to a story that, according to the actor's fans, didn't deserve to be trapped in the dark. But even beyond that desire, the case opened up a broader conversation about how society processes loss, especially when it is shrouded in uncertainty. Menglong's story, as pieced together from multiple unverified accounts, highlighted the collective need to find meaning, even amid unanswered questions. Así, el largo camino hacia la reconstrucción no es solo un trayecto emocional para quienes admiraban al actor. Es también un espejo que refleja las fragilidades de sistemas complejos, la necesidad de protección para los más vulnerables y la importancia de garantizar espacios seguros dentro de industrias altamente competitivas. This process continues, and it will remain active as long as the case remains open in the collective memory. Because, beyond the information that may be officially published, There is a persistent desire that no story, especially one shrouded in pain, silence, and bewilderment, be relegated to oblivion. Looking back and contemplating each fragment that makes up this story, an undeniable truth emerges. Beyond the testimonies, beyond the doubts, and beyond the lack of official clarity, the case of Wu Menglong has become a symbol of something deeper. His name no longer belongs solely to the entertainment industry. It now inhabits a collective emotional space where vulnerability, bewilderment, and the human need to understand what remains in the shadows coexist. This narrative journey has taken us from the tensest moments of that night to the way society reacted, first with confusion, then with a torrent of emotions that overwhelmed any attempt at control. We have explored the absence of a solid crisis management strategy, as well as the silences that ultimately amplified the uncertainty. And finally, we have observed how Menglong's memory grew beyond the facts, transforming into a mirror in which each viewer projects questions about power, fragility, and dignity. If anything, the story demonstrates that even in the midst of darkness, there is a constant drive to seek meaning. The reconstruction of Menglong is not limited to his figure. It represents the collective desire not to let silence have the last word. A society that questions, observes, and demands clarity is a society that refuses to resign itself. That's why, even though there are still unanswered questions, the echo of this story will continue to resonate. Not because someone imposes it, but because thousands of voices have decided not to let it fall into oblivion. And that decision, emotional, human, and deeply symbolic, is perhaps the most powerful act in this story. Even though we cannot change the past, we can decide what to do with what we have learned. Menglong's memory, as reconstructed by those who have clung to it with respect and sensitivity, becomes a reminder of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable, demanding transparency, and not allowing uncertainty to become the norm. Ultimately, this story does not end here. It lives on in those who continue to ask questions, in those who seek to understand, and in those who feel that a person's dignity deserves more than silence. If this story moved you, we invite you to keep it alive. Share this video so that more people can learn about it and reflect on its implications. We do not intend to impose conclusions. We only seek to ensure that no voice, no memory, and no story marked by pain is relegated to obscurity. Your participation is essential. Share, comment, and keep the conversation going. Because as long as there are those who want to know more, Wu Menglong's story will not be erased.